Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with guest professor Colleen A. Vasconcellos, and the basis of the discussion will be the book Slavery, Childhood, and Abolition in Jamaica, 1788-1838. Dr. Colleen A. Vasconcellos is an associate professor of history at the University of West Georgia. Join us as we delve into the layers of her book, Slavery, Childhood, and Abolition in Jamaica, 1788-1838. So let's have a listen.
Much, Colleen, for coming on to the podcast to talk about your book, Slavery, Childhood, Abolition in Jamaica, 1788 to 1838. It was quite a book to read and to know all the different variances that happened during that time, and especially about children that aren't really discussed about as well. So before we start, I'll just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself.
Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me to participate on this podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you about this. As you know, children really aren't part of the discussion when it comes to history, any period really. And especially when we talk about enslavement, children really are sort of relegated to the periphery. So it's exciting to be able to talk about them and to bring their story out of the shadows. So a little bit about me. I'm a professor of Atlantic Studies at the University of West Georgia. I primarily teach classes on Latin American and Caribbean history. I'm also connected to the Africana Studies minor, the nutrition minor through a class on foodways that I teach, and the women's studies minor. So I'm sort of all over the place. Which is exciting because you get to share this field of history with so many other minors that you don't really think about being connected to it. So that's exciting. I got my PhD in 2004 from Florida International University in Miami. I am a Miami native, so it was good to go back home. And I've been working on this for years. I feel like they've become such a part of my life. I feel like I've gotten to know these children and gotten to know these girls. I've moved from childhood into girlhood studies. So I feel like I've really gotten to know these kids and gotten to know these girls. So it's exciting to be able to talk about them today.
Oh, that's great. And so we'll start. And so I guess what inspired you to write, Slavery, Childhood, Abolition in Jamaica? And as this is not a topic that's really discussed, right?
No, it's not. And, I never really thought about it as a topic. It actually started back with my master's. I was trying to come up with a topic for my master's thesis, and I wanted to do something on the slave trade because I knew I wanted to get into slave studies and research enslavement. And I was thinking primarily of North America.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to start with the slave trade because I felt like that was the beginning of everything. And my advisor at the time was an Africanist. And so I started from that African beginning and then just sort of brought them over through that research, started connecting those dots from the beginning in Africa and then connected it through the slave trade. And I was talking with him about a topic and how to narrow down this huge focus on the slave trade. And he actually suggested looking at children and their experiences in the slave trade because nobody really talked about them. And I was actually sort of on that path anyway because I had found a commission for a ship that was commissioned just for a cargo of young boys between the ages of 12 and 15. That was the entire cargo. So already I was starting to move into that direction and see how children were really perceived as being an investment. So I worked on that for my master's thesis, and then that eventually expanded into my dissertation at the PhD level. And I moved out of North America because I took this class on Florida and the Caribbean, and it just blew my mind. And I was like, this is where I need to be, because I'm already a Floridian. And I just was like, I need to be here. It just felt, just something clicked. Historians kind of have this aha moment, and that was mine. And then I started moving away from the slave trade and moving into their experiences being enslaved as children in Jamaica. And I had this huge amount of time to do research, and I just sort of let the sources guide me.
Mm.
I went in with some questions that I wanted to ask, and I wanted to know what their lives were like, what their everyday lives were like. And the sources sort of pushed me in this direction of abolition as being this catalyst for the change in the quality of their lives. And so next thing I know, I have this dissertation that's finished, and that became the book.
No, that's great. And then, of course, how did the institution of slavery impact the lives and experience of children in Jamaica during this period?
So they really go through a huge transition.
Mm.
I sort of look at 1780s as the
Mhm.
time when things begin to change. And I think part of this is because of the Enlightenment, but I think part of this also has a connection to capitalism and the way that the market economy is being driven. You have the Industrial Revolution, which is really being fed by slavery, which is being fed by the slave trade. I mean, the really industrial areas like Bristol, Liverpool, those are the ones that are the centers of the slave trade. And so you see how these market economies really are being linked. And at first, children are really seen as being burdens. They're not something that anyone is really paying attention to. The plantation owners and managers don't really want them on the estates because they're just taking away from profits. They're not, it's when I say this out loud, it really hits you as to the magnitude of this situation, but they don't enter the workforce until the age of 5 or 6. And so we're sitting here going, what, 5 or 6? But for them, it's like, this is 5 years where you have no work potential. So it's really this, as a Marxist historian, this really is that model of them being the means of production. And so children don't enter into that equation until there's a threat to that system and a threat to that capitalist economy, and that comes from abolition. And so once the abolitionists start making some headway and their petitions start getting some leverage, that's when plantation owners and managers realize that these children are investments, because if the trade stops, then they have no supply and they have to make some changes, which we'll talk about, later when we get into the laws and things. But that's when they start to reevaluate, and they're not looking at them as children. They never look at them as children. They really just see them as a means to an end, this way that I can control the system and salvage my economy. And it's disgusting. But the children go through this transition, of changing from burden to investment. And then when we get to apprenticeship, they sort of revert back to being a burden again, because at the age of, I can't remember what it is, 6, they aren't allowed to work. They're not considered apprentices. They're considered full free. And so your entire economy collapses within a generation. And that's, to them, once again, they're a burden. And so I think to Jamaicans and to the enslaved, they have a completely different outlook on this. They always see them as children. They see them as a connection to the ancestors. They see them as being a connection to the past, as a preservation of not economy, of culture and language. And then when apprenticeship comes, they're seen as being children finally. They're allowed to be children. So I think that there's this struggle that really goes between the plantation manager and the plantocracy, if you want to call them that. There's this struggle between them and the enslaved parents and the enslaved elders to really protect these children and to make sure that they're allowed to be children. And you see that through the entire period.
No, definitely. And as you mentioned before, kind of alluded to, is with the words, with these children being viewed as little adults, what were some of the words used to describe them and the impact of those words?
And you see that transition in the language. You see the transition. At first they're children. They're always children. They may call them infants. And you can sort of see how they define childhood at the same time. And this is a transition period, I think, just for everyone in society recognizing stages of childhood. But there's a privilege that comes with that. And so white children have the privilege of having a stage of childhood, whereas African children and Jamaican children, and anywhere, within a slave economy, the privilege of being a child doesn't come until freedom, really. And even then there's some issues, so you'll see it in the language. They're seen as being an infant. Then you see them as being a child. Sometimes they're mentioned as being a child. Sometimes you'll just know that they're a child because of their name. They're connected, Sally's, Suki, or somebody. You know that they're a child because their name is now attached to their mother. But then you start to see that reproductive potential being attached to their label. And so you see it especially with girls. They don't call them girls, they'll call them woman girls, because now she's hit puberty. So that she's got that potential. And then eventually they just label them as breeding wenches, because they don't even acknowledge, that they're girls. They are now able to contribute to the market economy based on that reproductive potential. And what's interesting when you think about the laws, I know we're going to get to this in a minute, but one of the laws I think that comes out in the 1780s is this law that prohibits intercourse with a child below the age of 10. So you have to kind of put this in a framework, that sort of shows you where they see childhood is at the age of 10. But then we create laws for a reason. And so that means there's enough of this happening before the age of 10, or they've decided that 10 is their cutoff, that this is happening enough to where we necessitate this law. So they sort of use 10 as being that cutoff, which when you think about a 10-year-old today, there's so much, they're not even in that place, So I think you can sort of see where they're doing it. And you don't see it as much with the boys. Sometimes you'll see a man boy, but usually it's a boy or a man, but it's really with the girls that you see it.
Yeah, I guess it's to that, as you said, the potential for what they can be able to offer to the planters, and in terms of their profits, right? In this type of setup, right?
Absolutely.
So, and then of course, what role did the plight of enslaved children play in the broader abolitionist movement?
So I think what we want to do when we think of abolitionists is we want to place them on the side of right. We want them to do this because of a moral imperative that they have, and we want them to advocate for the enslaved, and we want them to advocate for these children. And I think some of them do. John Brown comes to mind. Historically, he's been painted as somebody who's certifiably insane. And there were some issues, but he was also very radical for the time. And so to categorize him in that way sort of diminishes the potential and the power that he had. I think with abolitionists in this time period, when you're thinking about the 18 teens and the 1820s and then moving into the 1830s, I think that they have an agenda, and they believe that slavery is wrong, but it's sort of the same as the abolitionists that we see in the 1860s in North America. Once they achieve that goal, they disappear. It's the argument that they have against slavery. It's not necessarily improving a quality of life, advocating for citizenship or moving into educational opportunities or, trade opportunities or things like that. And so I think children sort of fall into this because they're being used by abolitionists to prove a point and not necessarily as someone that they really genuinely want to protect. They're using them as an argument. And that isn't to say that every abolitionist is this way. I think there really are genuinely abolitionists who are ahead of the time. I can't think of any to come, because I'm sure they're busy doing their work and not writing things that would have been published. So the person who I think believes in the true goal is the person who doesn't have to tell you this is what they're doing. So I think a lot of these abolitionists, we really want them to be those people, but they're using children to prove a point, which I guess at the end of the day, it gives us the opportunity on this side of it to see their lives. So in that respect, it is helpful because I've been able to get at their stories
Yes.
through what abolitionists are talking about and through the things that they're observing in their writing. We have to take that with a grain, but it gives us opportunity that I think they didn't really intend. So it does work out for us as historians to be able to see, some window of life and daily life for these children. But I have mixed emotions about the abolitionists. I really want them to be who they say they are, but I don't think that a lot of them are who they say they are.
Yeah, and it's very hard, as you said. Most probably weren't writing, but it's very hard to come across that type of document to see where they did enhance after slavery had ended, what they did, what was done. So it's challenging. It's very hard not to project your own personal opinions as well and your biases, right? So, but there had to have been some sort of positivity there to at least change something. But in the greater scope of things, we don't necessarily see that. So
Yeah, right. And their writings even are filled with these microaggressions, and I'm just back here going, okay, do better. But it's we have to take what we get,
exactly.
as historians and be happy with what we have.
For sure. And then, of course, now with the legislation, the laws, because this was a tool, and you can either say it was either weaponized or if it was done in a very, positive light. But what were some of the key legislative milestones during this period that affected enslaved children?
So I look at this sort of as positive and negative. Because you have a lot of legislative things that are happening during this period, especially in the 1780s, because they feel like they're under attack and they see their economy in crisis. And so they're reacting the way that will protect them and not necessarily what will protect the enslaved or improve the enslaved. There's like a double-edged sword here. So the first one that really comes to mind is something called the Dolben's Act, and it's passed in 1788, and it relates to the slave trade, and it actually is very restrictive on who can be trafficked, and that's a term I'm using, who can be trafficked from Africa to the Caribbean. And they are you would think that they would limit the number of children, but they're not. They're limiting the number of adults, and they're trying to force cargoes to be much, much younger. And so they are limiting, and basically you have cargoes after the 1780s that are overwhelmingly full of adolescents. Or the cargoes will say that they're adults because that is a lower duty fee and a lower trade fee, and then they will take them off at night and put younger on. So it's difficult for us to get, a solid accounting. We have to take that into consideration. They're also limiting the gender. So they want more women and they want more girls aboard these ships because they are now associating what they categorize as breeding, to move this. So they're moving in that direction, and the legislation is sort of attacking abolition that way, because in 1788 we have our first petition that
Mhm.
really gets some headway in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And so, there's a potential for an end. And of course, we know it's only going to be in a couple more decades where you have an end to it completely. A legalized trade. It still continues well
Mhm.
after, but this is a crucial period for them. Now, on the Caribbean side, within the colonies, you have a series of measures and acts that are passed by island assemblies that are called ameliorative acts or amelioration. You'll see it referred to as amelioration. And so, what they're arguing is we need to improve the conditions within the plantations. And you think, oh, that's great. They're going to give them more food. They're going to, have them work less. They're going to lower the expectations of how much sugar needs to be brought into harvest, or, but that's not really the case. What it is they're tying it to tax. And so if you have more natural increase, then you will get a tax break. And if you have less natural increase, then you may have to pay more in taxes. So they're still thinking in terms of economic and still thinking in terms of money. And so what we want the plantation owners to do is to actually do a deep dive, look at themselves in the mirror and say, wow, I really am not a good person. I need to feed these people and give them better conditions. I need to allow them to do the things that they need to do. And that's not what they're doing. What they're doing is they're trickling that into a reward system that they create for women, where they give them incentives to have more children. So they're just like tainting the whole thing by, again, doubling down on this reproductive um, expectation now, and so you see not just women being included in this, but now it's the girls. The girls are being given the incentives, and they're asking the girls, you might want to think about moving in that direction, and they're matching them up. They're taking people out of homes and they're marrying them based on their reproductive potential, how they're profiling males and how they're profiling boys. And they're looking at it's almost a scientific form of racism that we haven't really given that much thought to, about how they're really categorizing. And then you see, I think the thing that's just the most telling for me is there's a family called the Codringtons, and they're based out of England, but they have holdings throughout the Caribbean, but mostly in Barbados. And the Codringtons plantations are breeding estates. And they're not focused on sugar. And sugar is the most lucrative thing during this time. I mean, it is the thing that will make or break a colony. But the Codringtons see this reproductive value, and they see how much you can make off of this. And they're turning this into a business. And it's disgusting, but it really shows you like how much pressure they're putting on these girls, how much pressure they're putting on these people, not just, the 20-hour days that you're working, but now you have this. You have no freedom to have a life of your own. Everything is being managed, down to your very minute, and every day that you have on this earth, the closer that you get to reproductive potential. I mean, they're scoping out kids. They're doing studies. They're having doctors come to estates and look at the reproductive potential of the people that are working on the estates. They're lining up traders to bring, they have preferences with certain ethnic groups. It's like a business, a
Yeah.
whole business that happens underneath the larger sugar industry that's really developing during this time.
Yeah, and that's just again another way to use the law to benefit them in a way, right?
Yeah,
So it just, as you
exactly.
said, it's just unbelievable. But these are the things that were happening during that time. And as I said, It's just the different layers of all what was happening and what was going on during this time. And I guess, for the researchers, what were the primary sources that you relied on for your research, and how did you access them?
So the primary sources are difficult because um, you're only getting one side of the story. We don't have, there's very few narratives that we have out there that were written by people who experienced this life as an enslaved person. Um, on the slave trade side, you have more because we have Equiano, Venture Smith, Audubon, Cuguano. They have written narratives, but they're also very heavily influenced by the abolitionist movement. And there's this religious component to those narratives that sort of detracts from the story that we're looking for. And so you have to sort of take that with a grain. But to try and get at an enslaved person's experiences from their perspective and from their point of view, it's almost impossible because they're not allowed to learn how to read. They're not allowed to learn how to write. Their life expectancy is so short.
Mm,
They don't have the means to be able to record their experiences. So we have to look from a planter or a plantation manager's point of view, or an abolitionist or a minister or somebody's point of view. So you have to sort of really dig deep, and it gets hard. So we do have some diaries that are out there. There's letter books that are out there, so you can see correspondence back and forth. Um, there are some people who are more observant than others.
mhm.
So they'll recount stories, or they'll talk about, kids that have done this, or, things like that. You'll see that in the diaries. Laws, I went to laws a lot.
Yeah,
The Jamaican Assembly, all of their laws are preserved.
yeah.
And then they also correspond with uh, George the Third and George the Fourth laws that come out of Parliament. And so we're able to sort of see that the parliamentary procedures, you can see
Yes.
those. You can see the debates that are happening in Parliament. You can see the arguments that are happening there. And then I went to just plantation maps, looking and seeing how plantations are organized, what their design is. You can get so much about, what environment someone is living in when you can see how a plantation is designed and just where the villages are, um, you know, them talking in their plantation inventories. Usually they just list them by age,
Mhm.
um, or sometimes they'll list them by whatever gang they're in. So you have like the first gang is the adults, and then the second is like adolescents with some adults, and then the third is the children's gang. And so you'll see them sort of organized. There was one plantation inventory that actually did it by family, by cabin, and that was I did a dance in the archives. I'm not lying. I screamed when I saw it because the English are notoriously bad about record keeping. The Spanish, they'll tell you a telenovela,
Yeah.
and every single thing, and the British are just like son of, daughter of, they don't give you anything. And so to see something like that, but you really, I mean, anything and everything I could get my hands on, I pulled it and I asked for it from the archivist. And I just said, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, especially, I mean, even when you're talking about the enslaved, but when you're looking for children, it's even harder because some people, you don't even know if they are children because they're not telling you. And you don't see them appear, like really clearly appear, until the 1780s, which then lets you know, okay, they're on the radar, because before they're not even making it into the inventories. So the absence of a source for me was a source,
Mhm.
so it you have to get creative.
Yes. Definitely, and I know for myself, during using the laws, that would really help. That, as you said, it's your guide to
Mm,
really get at information and where next to go to find things, and of course, definitely the maps, because it gives a great visual of how
mm,
those plantations are, how they have been kind of laid out, mapped out, and what's on them as well, and where they have their enslaved individuals. living on the plantation as well, and where their cabins are, and so on and so forth. So it again, it's just revealing other layers that are just not really being said. And in your book, Colleen, you shared many stories of what children were doing during this time. Were there any particular poignant personal stories or case studies from your book that highlighted the experience of the enslaved children?
So there's a few that I like to say I've gotten to know.
Yeah.
It's the names that you see, you don't see them very often, appear again. So a lot of times they're just there for anecdotal or for some evidence. But there are some individuals who I've been able to get to know through the research. There's three girls actually that I've been focusing on now. One girl called Sally,
Mhm.
and you can see through Sally just how destructive this institution was on her life. She came to Jamaica at a very young age, probably about 8 or 9. We believe she was from Congo, or West Central Africa. It depends on how the traders sort of classify them. And she came very resistant to the situation. And at such a young age of 8 or 9, she was a fighter.
Mm.
Um, and she was purchased by one of the most notorious plantation owners, Thomas Thistlewood. He's probably the most vile person I have ever run across in the sources. He absolutely disgusts me. Um, he's a predator, a sexual predator, and he's a pedophile, and he has absolutely no accountability. In the Caribbean, they have no accountability. Um, it, it's it gives new meaning to no accountability, the lives that they have here. And so he purchased her so that she could learn to be a seamstress, and he put her under the tutelage of one of his master seamstresses, and she resisted from the day that she was there, to the point that Doll, the person that was supposed to be teaching her how to do this, basically threw her hands up and said, "You have to take this girl. I can't take her anymore." So he punished her by putting her in the fields, and she just ran away, ran away, ran away. So this is constant
Mm.
up through her adolescence. And then you begin to see it chip away at her mental wellness. She becomes an alcoholic. She becomes very destructive, to the point where even her own community has ostracized her. She has no friends. She's violent. She is destructive, self-destructive. She becomes a cutter. She's taking it out on her body. And by the end of the time that I see her, when she's in her 30s, she's transported off the island, and I'm trying to find her now. Usually they're sent to Georgia, but it's very difficult to find them because their names are changed, and I don't even know where she ended up. But he sent her to Georgia. He's just like, "I can't deal with you anymore." But you can just see it eats her from the inside out. It absolutely destroys her. There's another girl who had a very different life from her. She was born to one of the vestry owners. So he was a man of the cloth. I don't know much about who her mother was. I don't know much about her story other than she belonged to the vestry itself. So the parish minister. And she was mixed, so her father tried to purchase her freedom. I don't think he was able to do that for her mother, or even where her mother was, or if she belonged to the vestry. I don't have any of that information. So it leads me to believe that she probably maybe passed in childbirth or something. But he tried to purchase her freedom, and the law stated that you had to provide someone of equal or more value. And so he purchased an enslaved woman to exchange for her freedom. And the parish vestryman stole the woman and left. And he didn't have the money to purchase another woman, because when you think of the value and you add it to today's economy, it's like a very expensive car about the worth. So it's a lot of money. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars probably. in today's money. And so she basically was stuck in that vestry. But she followed into this path of, she entered eventually into a relationship with one of the plantation managers or a merchant or somebody who was white in that town. And she had 4 children. And eventually, someone brought her story and her experience to the Jamaican Assembly and made a case for her and petitioned for her freedom. And the Assembly actually gave her her freedom, which is the only time I've ever seen this. So I think somebody connected to her had some sort of power on the island. But it did not create a precedent where this would happen with other people.
Mhm.
So there's someone, I'm trying to find more information, and it's very, hush hush and behind the scenes. So I'm unable to find a lot of information. And then once she gets her freedom with her children, she's gone. I don't see anything with her. So I'm right now I'm trying to figure out, this difference, not just of childhood, but of girlhood,
Yes.
what their experiences were like, because they really are both sides of the spectrum. And then there's one more that I could talk about these kids
Yeah.
for days. There's one more that I want to talk about. It's this boy named Brutus. I first saw him in the advertisements for Runaways.
Mhm.
And there's so much that you can get from this advertisement. He's young, he's probably maybe like 10 or 11. He says he's a Creole. He says he's a Creole, not his owner. So that means he's been purchased already once. And so he's run away to find his mother, who is somewhere in Spanish Town, but he doesn't know where. So he's looking for her, but he also speaks 3 different languages. So what we get from that is not just this kid is a fighter and he's trying to find his mother, and that bond is very strong. We get that. But what we also get is the life that he's had up to this point. He's 10 or 11 and he's already been sold once that we know of.
Yeah.
He's living somewhere in an urban area. He has some connection with his mother still because he knows where she's gone. His owner at the moment does not know much about his story, so he's probably newly purchased. I think they were probably split.
Yeah.
One went one way, one went the other. But the fact that he already speaks 3 different languages, which means he's speaking 2 different African dialects and he speaks English that we know of. So it really gives you this sense of just how diverse this community was, how smart these kids are. I think we see this with immigrant cultures today. You
Mhm.
have this argument, that they're uneducated and they're not smart and but they already speak so many different languages. It's hard to learn English. English is one of the most difficult languages to learn. But this kid is smart. He has an agenda. He's not going to be, knocked down by the fact that he's been sold to somebody else. But his childhood probably was one where he had a very diverse community around him, where he was influenced by different cultures, different languages, and it makes us realize, or forces us to realize, that it's not this homogenous African culture, that it's a very distinct ethnic groups, distinct kinship groups, distinct cultures that are there. And I think it's really testament to what's happening on the ground that a lot of people sort of miss, including historians, where they just really focus on the numbers, or they create this victimization of these children or the enslaved, where you really don't get a sense of just how much agency they have. And so that's why I like Brutus, because he really forces us to question everything that we have learned and everything that's in the historiography at the moment.
No, absolutely, because again, it gives a totally different narrative than what we already know. And what you said in regards to being able to purchase freedom, that is a select privileged few that actually have the power to be able to do that, and the funds to be able to do that. And then of course they have to show that they're supporting that person once they have been granted their freedom. But yeah, there were just so many things in her book that I was just going, wow, this is just, the adults were having something on their end, but as well, the children having a lot in terms of, as I said, with all these laws to kind of feel, I guess, define the parameters in which they could be able to navigate. And with the story that you just indicated with Brutus, the fact that he still had some sort of agency is very significant. And this leads to the next question in terms of how did the enslaved children and their families resist and show resilience against the oppressive conditions that they faced?
I think this sort of connects to the last question. I mean, we see them running away,
Yeah.
but I think we also see a child response of where they are being forced by their situation, not just by the planters,
Mhm.
but they're being forced into an adulthood. They're acting like adults. I mean, this is a very adult thing to escape and run away and look for family. That's a very adult thing to do. And they're being thrust into this world, and they're being forced to into an adulthood by the circumstances that they're in. And I think that, in a way, I think what we have to do is we have to think about how we would define what resistance is. Is resistance something where you're actually physically resisting, in some sort of violent way? You're destroying tools, you're running away, you're doing something that has some sort of tangible connection to a resistance. So we see children doing all of that. There's when you look into the court records, you see them stealing things. You see them participating in the market economy, probably with stolen goods. They're taking them to market, and I think how the white population looks at them as some sort of vagrant. These kids are criminals, they're this, they're that, but they're not. These kids are supporting their families in the only way that they know how at this moment, and that is to help bring something to the table that they can bring in a way that they can help that personal, familial kinship connection. And so we see them acting in those ways. We see them setting fire to fields. We see them acting like they're sick when we know that they're not. But we also see them resisting letting this life destroy them. I mean, I think Sally, in her way, was resisting. She was resisting, very much resisting at first, but as she let it destroy her, she was trying to fight as best as she could to resist the situation, but she just was unable to. So we see her resisting as much psychologically as we do physically. So I think you see them doing it in that way as well. But then also just maintaining their culture, maintaining their languages, maintaining the food that they cook, maintaining their foodways, the aesthetics that we see, the way that they do their hair. There's things that disappear. You'll see in the sources, they'll call them country marks. There's ways
Mhm.
of cutting into the skin and creating patterns that was usually someone of importance or somebody who came from a royal family or some sort of lineage. Those types of things disappear. And I think it's because it gives them distinguishable marks that would allow them to be identified if they ran away. But we do see things like naming practices.
Mhm.
We see, day names, African day names that are continued. We see connections to the ancestors. We see connections to ethnic groups. They're naming their children Ashanti in Africa. They know where they come from. They're passing their stories down. When I went into the archives and I had this big question, this is so naive. I had this big question. I was like, children are the link between Africa and Europe. They are the link between Africa and Jamaica. They're the reason why these things continue. I still believe this, but I couldn't find it in the archives at all. But I still think that children were that conduit, that they're learning these stories and they're passing them on to their children. The connection I think that Jamaica has today, to these stories. There's things that have changed, the Anansi stories, they used to be sung, now they're spoken. Things like that have changed through the years. But I think that enslaved children are the reason, especially during the apprenticeship period, because they survived, and they're able to keep that connection and to keep that culture alive, more so than you see in North America.
Mhm.
We don't have a lot of the language left, maybe Gullah Geechee cultures, but we don't have a lot of the old languages. We have the kinship systems. We have the importance of family, the respect of elders. We have, the singing and the connections to culture, a lot of the food traditions, but it's not like it is in the Caribbean because they didn't have that constant influx and they didn't have the way to keep that culture alive by having it constantly alive. And, the diversity of that, is still very
Mhm.
present. So I think children are resisting slavery, erasing that. Slavery has a legacy of destroying or attempting to destroy families
Yeah,
and attempting to destroy um, a connection to ancestors. And I think the survival that you see today is proof that the resistance was successful.
definitely, definitely. And I guess this kind of leads into the next question in terms of how did the abolition of slavery affect the lives of former child slaves and their families in Jamaica in terms of being a child?
Um, so I think it goes back to how we looked at what the abolitionist motives really were when we were discussing that earlier. I think when you have the missionaries who are coming to the island in the 1820s and 1830s, especially, they're really bent on this idea of mass baptism. I mean, you see entire plantations that are being baptized on the same day. They just like travel around and they're doing it. You're not getting any kind of thing from that. It's just for them, And so I think I think you see children being caught up into that because they really want the children to be the ones who are baptized, and then they're also forcing this idea of Christian marriage or this Western idea of
Mm.
marriage onto these families. And they're not looking at the children who are born before that Christian marriage took place as being legitimate, this idea of legitimacy that's so important to people in the 18th century and 19th century. So I think children get caught up into that argument as well. But this push, of imposing this Christian education or this Christian socialization, these Western concepts of what it means to be a child and what it means to be loyal, using the Bible and the Testaments as a way of, imposing this Protestant work ethic and this loyalty that they want from this generation who they know is going to be free pretty soon. So they're trying to use the scripture as a way of, making them more docile, easier to control, completely taking them away from their parents because they understand, this is something that the West does in every colonial structure that they build. They do this to, Indigenous children in Australia. They do it to Indigenous children in North America. They remove them from their parents and their community and their kinship groups and put them in these schools where they assimilate them into whatever mold they want them to be. And so children are very much caught into that. They're being educated to be Christian workers.
Mhm.
It's like a trade school with a
Yeah.
very Christian message to it. And so children again are being used as a means of production and
Yeah.
now by missionaries. And now, the whole system is so connected. When you think about, the people who own the plantations are in the House of Lords, they're in the House of Commons, they're in the Jamaican Assembly, they're the missionaries. The missionaries are on the ground saying, I'm fighting for this, but they own people, they own plantations and pens. And so you see just how, endemic this system really is. And a way to get out of it, is almost impossible. It's not until um, full emancipation, full free, that you really see them able to really pull out. And then it's not until the 1860s with, the uprisings and the revolts that take place on the ground fighting against this colonial structure, to really begin. The struggle is emancipation never ends anything.
Mhm.
It just creates a new thing that you have to fight. And I think children will always be a part of that. They'll always be used by whatever entity is trying to control a situation because they look at children as being this blank slate
Mhm.
and this opportunity to control, and they'll always be in the middle of that.
Yeah. No, it's just using to be able to mold what they would like,
Exactly.
right? It's what, so, and continuing with that, the legacy of slavery, how does it impact children and education in Jamaica today?
So I think today's structure, it's difficult for me to comment on what's happening today because
Mhm.
I really am an 18th century Caribbeanist. So my comfort in speaking on a reflection of this, really ends with like maybe the 1860s.
Okay.
I think we see an education system that's created post emancipation that continues a lot of these things. And I think this legacy of slavery, you see it in so many different ways. You see a legacy of the enslaved in the ancestors that they have on the ground today. You see those families, you see the survival, you see the connections. So you see a positive in that way where these families survived and their names live on and the culture is there and the foods are maintained. It's some of it has been reinvented, but a lot of it is there. So I think you see things like that. You see this reverence for kinship. You see this strength in community. You see, this changing and evolving idea of what family is. It's not just the family that's your biological kin. It's the
Mhm.
shipmates that you traveled over. It's the people who were within your village. I think the West likes to say it takes a village, but they really don't understand what a village is.
Mhm.
And I think a village comes from that shared experience, and that shared experience created this community that's very, very close. Um, the sense of community in the Caribbean is so different than how we would, just in my background, how we would define community in Latin America. Or, growing up in Miami, our sense of community was very different than the friends that I had who were from Caribbean families. So I think you see that, this importance of it. But then I think you also see the systemic racism, and that's so endemic. You see, the legacy of this in public health, with the higher instances of diabetes and the higher instances of congestive heart failure and the illnesses that the Black community and the Caribbean community really endures now stems from the malnutrition and the conditions that were in um, this period of slavery and enslavement. And that travels through, we talk a lot about generational trauma, and that certainly is something that's a legacy. But that generational trauma isn't just a wellness idea, it's
Mhm.
also a public health idea. And that I think we see that as a legacy as well.
Yeah, for sure. And then, Colleen, you looked at all of these different resources and all of these different narratives. Like, how did writing this book affect you personally and emotionally?
It was hard. I mean, I had some experience with this when I was working on my MA with the thesis, thinking about children's experiences and what they went through aboard ship. That was hard. So I had some inkling of what it was going to be like. I thought it would be easier because they're on a plantation and they're not on a ship, but it's not. It's not easier. Um, you think that you've seen everything, but then you get into a source and you're just like, wow. I took a lot of walks. I needed
Mm.
to clear my head. When I spent a month in Thomas Thistlewood's diaries. Um, I hate having to talk about him in a positive light because he really is evil. If there's evil, it's him, and the things that he did, the things that he subjected them to, he told us in detail. He wrote in his diary every single day for 30 years. And you're like, wow, that's great. He's so observant. But then at the same time, I'm like, it's a constant every day that you see what he's doing. He took delight in torturing people. He would tell us, stories. Oh, I heard this folklore. He would tell me a story like a nursery rhyme or something like that. I'm like, oh, that's great. And then he would tell you what he did to the woman later, and or the girl. And that law, I really think that law where it says you can't have sex with someone under the age of 10 is because of people like him.
Yeah.
It was part of his seasoning process, to get them acclimated to the life that he wanted to put them through. The Caribbean is for people like him because they come from England. There's no laws. They're all like him. They just get on the ground and it's like a smorgasbord for them. They just have unfettered access to everything and anything that they want to do. I took great delight when he got syphilis. I celebrated, like we had a party when I saw he had syphilis, and he talked about how painful the mercury treatments were. And I was like, you deserve every minute of that. So people like him, there was a point when I got halfway through his diary. I took a week off. I was like, I can't
Yeah.
do that. And then I thought about the privilege that I have to say, I'm going to step away from this torture that you're going through because I can't handle it. And it really sort of affected me that way because I felt guilty.
Mhm.
Felt like I felt like guilty because I was able to step away from this and take a break, and they couldn't. And that weighed on me. There were times where I was just depressed because of the things that I was reading and the things that I was going through. It really did take a toll. And when I finished, usually people within the first 2 or 3 years, they converted their dissertation into their first book. It took me
Mhm.
6 years before I could actually pick this up again.
Mm.
I worked on some things and I focused on my teaching, and I brought this into the classroom and I used it, in that way. But it was hard to come back to it. And it's hard now sometimes to come back to it. And I still feel a lot of that guilt and a lot of that privilege, that I can just step away from this. And I know I have, DNA tests are telling me, that I have some connection to it, but my connection to it is like 4%. And for me to say, I'm always going to be this person who is looking on the inside. I'm an observer of this life, and I have to be very cognizant of that and understand what that responsibility is,
Mhm.
especially living in Florida, where it's illegal to talk about these things,
Mm.
that you have to understand that as a historian, it's your responsibility. So I was very cognizant of that too, that, that's how I can deal with what I'm feeling, is that I have to make sure that people read this and understand what their lives were like. But I have to be careful too, because I don't want to be like a white savior. Even though I'm Latina, I'm still, I still present as a white person, and I don't want to be, somebody who's like, oh, I'm giving them a voice. I'm not. I'm writing about their experiences so that people will know that their experiences existed. And I think that's the responsibility that we have.
No, definitely. And as you said, Colleen, this is definitely, it's a lot of heavy material that you're looking at. And just to read, and as I said, we're just reading what their experiences were, and looking at these documents, and you're just, I mean, just like how you said, you got up in the archives. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've embarrassed myself reading passages and just going, oh my God, what is it that I've now had, as you said, the privilege to actually
Mm.
read and understand and to look at, and just go, wow, this is just unbelievable. But this did happen. And you're right, it does weigh on you to read these passages, to read and to know that this is what life was like for them at that time. And these narratives, they're not, as I said, they're not really told, they're not really talked about, but they need to be, because this is what these are the things that actually happened, and not just the generalized narrative that is given out there for everyone to say, yeah, this was it, and kind of, put it down, so to speak, when it was actually more horrific than anyone could have ever imagined.
Yeah,
And
I agree. And I think too, though, I think as somebody who works on childhood and girlhood, I think that we also have this responsibility of sort of combating this idea of how people see children. They see them as being innocent, they see them as being, not really having any agency. They see them as, their world is nothing but play, and they're not serious, and they're not that. But what these children went through and what these girls went through, I think, is incredibly important. But we also see them acting in ways that is very contradictory to the way that we see children and define childhood. I mean, there's one instance of a girl, Minetta. She poisoned her owner. And we want to look at her. She's what, 15. So we want to say, oh, she's innocent. She's just a girl, but she took poison and put it in his brandy and gave it to him. And then accounts are saying that she stood over him while he died. Like, think about what this girl has gone through, that she is taking that type of initiative. And then she blamed her grandmother. Like, we want to see her as this innocent little girl who's just going to cower behind the scenes, but she took matters into her own hands. I am incredibly proud of her. And I think that type of stuff, we need to talk about these things. We need to show that these kids are fighting just like the adults are, because it gives us this idea of the enslaved are not just victims.
yes,
It's not just moving from calling them slaves and now we call them enslaved.
yeah,
Now this is seeing them as people who have
mm,
lives, who take initiative, who are fighting, and they haven't given up. They're not victims. They have been placed into this situation against their will, and they were trafficked across the ocean, but they are fighting. And that is incredibly important. And I think that is a narrative that we need to do more.
yes,
And even my peers are not doing that. They are not taught, they are feeding into this stereotype that these people are victims, and they're not. They are people who are fighting just like everyone else. They are no different than the Irish who are brought over here, or anyone else who's in a situation where they are faced with this type of life. They are going to fight.
yeah.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what they're doing.
No, and that's very important because, as I said, what I've read and what I've uncovered has just been, as I said, just mind blowing as to what you can actually see, what the resistance was, what they did to, bring about their own power, their own agency, their own decision making, and it's quite a thing, and and just to have that connection to that, to know is really great. And what advice would you give to other researchers or historians interested in studying history of childhood under slavery?
Um, So my advice would be, don't, first of all, don't give up. If you don't find anything, there's going to be days where you're going to spend days looking at sources. You're going to be in the archives. You're going to have a whole week go by and you're not going to see anything. Don't give up, because the next day you may find a treasure trove, and you can have sources for days where you're actually getting a lot of the story that you need. Look at everything, anything and everything, because you never know where you're going to be able to find it. The the issue with doing a field or being part of a field like childhood studies or girlhood studies, I think more so with childhood studies than girlhood studies, is this is a field that is, this is a horrible pun, but it's very much in its infancy.
No.
I mean, I think it's been around, as a field, a legitimate field, for maybe 2 or 3 decades, but it's still something that we're trying to be taken seriously by other fields. Girlhood studies has been connected to women's studies always, but now we're starting to, step aside from that and move into being our own field in our own right. And so you're going to you're going to run into a lot of resistance and a lot of opposition when you're presenting your work and when you're doing research. I remember, I will never forget this, a very prominent historian in the field of Africana studies and the African diaspora asked me in grad school, uh, what are you working on? And I said, oh, I'm looking at enslaved children in Jamaica. And he looked at me and said, what children? And I was like,
Oh,
let me show you, like, and this is a person who's well established in the field that doesn't actually believe that the children are there.
wow.
And so when you think about the field itself not believing that they're there, then how hard is it going to be to find them in the sources? So you're just going to have to be just it's like investigative
Yes.
work. You're really going to have to dig, look at every single thing, and just take a deep breath and keep looking, because it's
Yes.
it's going to be hard, but I think it's well worth doing, because looking at these kids and seeing how much they fight and how much they want you to know that they're there.
Yeah.
It's not just that they're resisting, they want you to know that they're
Mhm.
there.
Exactly.
They want to be recognized. They want to be part of the narrative, and they're trying so hard to get you to see them. That is our responsibility, is to allow them to tell their story, to create the space for them so that they can tell their story, because the adults have been talking for too long.
Oh, no, thank you for that. And, Colleen, as we come to an end of this wonderful discussion about children in the time of slavery, what would you like to leave the listeners as a final thoughts?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you for making it this far through the podcast. I mean, I could talk about these kids all day. The enthusiasm that I have for this field, the love that I have for history, I want people to have that. Um, when you tell somebody that you're a history major, that you're a historian, the humanities are under attack and people don't really appreciate their history. And I just want people to have the same enthusiasm for history and for this period, and to see these people and have this open mind, and to talk about them and tell their stories and read their stories, and I want people to have that, um, and I just want people to be interested and to want to learn more. Read a book, do some Googling, find your connection. Whatever side of the aisle that you're on, find your connection to this history, because your history has contributed as much to the present as it has to the past. And so understanding where you fall into this, I think, is really important too. And you're going to have to wrestle with that, because that's part of doing the work. So I think, these are things that we as citizens, looking at history as part of our citizenship. And I think it's incredibly important that we continue doing that. No matter how we do it, we just need to continue doing it.
No, definitely. As I said, I couldn't agree more with you, Colleen, and I really do appreciate you coming on and talking about this on the podcast. As I said, these are narratives that are not really talked about, and a lot of what this podcast is about is a lot of the narratives that aren't really talked about, and to where, for people that are what do want to be family historians, where they need to look, and how they'll probably have to wrestle with a lot of their emotions when they're looking at some of these records, some of these documents that can be very horrific to look at. But again, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.